Everybody, welcome to the week 2 overview lecture. This is the first of our overview lectures. My goal with these is just to kind of pretty generally go over some of the key themes and key points from this week's material. Bear in mind that this is stuff I'd normally cover in like 5 or 6 lecture periods, so we're talking this hour than if this class to take 7 weeks, hours last time. I really want to avoid making these lectures super long for the online version. So I'm going to move quickly. What I'll do is I'll call attention to parts of the American YOP textbook that cover some of this material. So if it's too fast and too general, you're going to fill in details with the American YOP. And if it feels too long, I'm doing my best. I'm trying to go through this as quickly as possible. But what I want to do primarily is just sort of go through topics I would touch on, but let American YOP kind of go into the detail. But try to highlight some key themes. As you'll notice, I've organized everything in the course around 5 key themes. Those are the question of who is an American, the economy, politics and government, the United States and the world, and technology and culture. So what I'm hoping to do is just impose some order upon this giant, massive material that's available to you in American YOP and in these lectures, and try to give you some ways to organize your knowledge of this material. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. Again, I'm going to move as quickly as I can, and we'll see how it goes. So the first theme I want to touch on is one we'll actually cover 2 components of today, and that's this question of who is an American, which might sound like an obvious question. Americans are people of America, or Americans are citizens. But really the boundaries between who is and is not considered a sort of full-fledged American, that's something that's all changing over time. And so I'm going to hit a couple components of that, and we'll go through other themes as well. So one of the key topics for who is an American for Unit 1 relates to the end of slavery and its meaning for African Americans in particular. Of course, under slavery, African Americans were not full-on members of the United States, not citizens, not have equal rights. And so one of our big stories of the course is going to be the effort to equalize the United States civilly more than it had been, provide more civil rights, more economic opportunities for African Americans. So some of you probably took History 1301. You learned about the era of slavery. You learned about the Civil War. Our story starts just at the end of the Civil War, in a period we call Reconstruction. If you want more information on Reconstruction to fill in the gaps that I'm going to kind of skip over, check out these sections of American YOP, Chapter 15. The easiest way to think about Reconstruction is it's an effort to integrate former slaves into the United States. It's functionally a federal government program. So after the Civil War, the federal government was dominated by the North because Southern states had left as part of secession and the creation of the Confederacy. And so the United States government was dominated by Northerners, and the dominant political party in the North at that time was the Republican Party, which is kind of flipped from how it is today, as you might know. So one of the goals of the Republican Party after the Civil War is to provide civil rights, opportunities, and general help for freed people, for African Americans. But what we'll see is that on the ground in the South, primarily Democrats are resisting those changes, right? Southern white Democrats are going to want to keep things as much like they were under slavery as possible, while Northern Republicans are going to try to transform the South in a more sort of modern, positive, and at least more equal direction. So in this early phase of Reconstruction, the United States government did succeed in doing some things for former slaves. For example, we have a number of constitutional amendments in this period. The 13th Amendment banned slavery in the United States. The 14th Amendment, which came a couple years later, provided citizenship for former slaves and really citizenship for anyone born in the United States. This is called birthright citizenship. As we're talking about this in summer 2025, it's an interesting time to be talking about birthright citizenship. That's kind of a current political topic under the Trump administration. I won't get into the details of that, but you can follow that if you're interested. The United States government also created a program called the Freedmen's Bureau to try to provide school for former slaves. Of course, it was against the law even to teach a slave to read in much of the United States. And so there's this huge thirst for education, as we'll see. Southern states, southern counties, southern towns, they were not going to build schools for black students, and so the federal government, through the Freedmen's Bureau, did that. So we've got the United States government taking some steps to try to advance the rights or the relative equality of African Americans. And then we've got the freed people themselves, who, of course, now that slavery's over, have a lot of desires, a lot of things they want to do that they could not do under slavery. So, for example, own land. Land was seen as the ticket to economic prosperity, equality, power, and independence. As I mentioned, there's also this intense desire for education, which was, at least to some extent, facilitated by the Freedmen's Bureau. And there's this desire to vote. And this is the third of the major constitutional amendments. So remember, the 13th Amendment banned slavery. The 14th provided citizenship for former slaves. The 15th Amendment said that you can't ban someone from voting based on their race. And so functionally, this gives black men, of course, women at this time were not voting black or white, gives black men access to the vote. We've got this structure being built up to try to kind of integrate African Americans into mainstream society, allow for economic participation, political participation, but all this stuff is being intensely resisted on the ground in the South, who see Reconstruction as this kind of intervention into their business. This is the federal government getting in the hair of Southern communities and Southern states. So Southern white Democrats are pushing back intensely against all this stuff. And so what we've got here is kind of a power struggle. The federal government, run by Northern Republicans, wants to change things in the South. Southern states, run by primarily white Democrats, are trying to resist those changes. Southern states passed a number of laws restricting black freedom. We call these black codes. They did all sorts of things. They limited the rights and abilities of African Americans to serve on juries or to testify in court. It also applied something called vagrancy laws, which basically allowed authorities to arrest black men who are just kind of minding their own business. They could be arrested for vagrancy and sentenced to forced labor or high fines. Again, you can read about more about all of this in American Yacht. And what really underlies all this Southern resistance is violence. There's just an enormous amount of violence aimed at primarily Southern black men, but also Southern white Republicans who are trying to help Southern black men or Southern black women. So we're talking thousands of murders. We'll talk about lynching a little bit later as well. Even more intimidation, right? The threats of violence. This is going to keep African Americans from pursuing those goals, right? They're going to be reluctant to own land if someone threatens them by saying, if you own land, we will kill you. It's also going to limit people's ability to vote, as you see here. Of course, this is just a cartoon, but here we've got a man, black man, intending to vote. With those pistols to his head, it's very unlikely he's going to vote the way he wants to vote. We can assume he wants to vote Republican. That was the party of African Americans at that time. And if you look, I don't know if you'll be able to see it in the video, but the caption says, of course he wants to vote the Democratic ticket. So this is kind of a good essence of Reconstruction. We have the legal ability of a black man to vote, thanks to the 15th Amendment, but the reality of violent resistance making that hard to do in practice. As part of this violence, this is where the Ku Klux Klan comes from. They're the most notorious of these kind of vigilante organizations using violence and the threat of violence to keep the black community in the South functionally cowering and not pursuing some of those goals we talked about a couple minutes ago. And so what happens is this resistance from the South basically works. Black men in particular, who initially voted in really high numbers, were basically scared out of voting. I mentioned the Freedmen's Bureau before. So, the Freedmen's Bureau is building these schools in the South. Groups like the Ku Klux Klan are burning those schools down. If you look at this cartoon, it kind of sums all of it up, right? We have this cowering black family, hanged black man in the background, burned down school in the background, and groups like the KKK working together to create the Union as it was, a white man's government that for many African Americans, practically speaking, was actually worse than slavery. So again, we've got this kind of tension here between the effort to change things in the South, but ultimately pretty successful resistance waged by Southern white Democrats. And all of this basically results in the failure of Reconstruction. Reconstruction began as this federal program designed to help African Americans, but ultimately the resistance coming out of the South was so intense that Reconstruction functionally failed to make those changes. It did provide a sort of structure through the 13th Amendment, 14th Amendment, 15th Amendment to provide citizenship and voting access and all that stuff, but really only on paper. And when we get to the civil rights movement later in the course, in a lot of ways we can think about the civil rights movement as an effort to make real the promise of Reconstruction, that there was this idea of citizenship, this idea of equal voting rights, but it really isn't going to become even remotely real until the 1960s when the Civil Rights Movement helped lead to the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. We'll get to that. So with the end of Reconstruction, I think you can kind of think of this as a failed promise, right? There's this idea that things can really improve for African Americans. They'll be integrated into modern American life. And in many respects, that didn't really happen in ways that I'll continue to talk about now. So the period after Reconstruction, in many ways, continues in a similar fashion for African Americans, where violence and legal restrictions are going to make it really hard for Black Southerners to live even remotely equal lives to what white Americans could expect at that time. Again, for more information on this, you can check out these sections of American Yacht. The South had this idea, a lot of Southerners had this idea that they're going to kind of modernize the way the North was doing. And we'll talk about what's going on in the North in a minute. But in the North, factories are booming, railroads are booming, the economy is becoming more modern, whereas the South had been primarily agricultural. And there were Southerners who said, well, we should kind of do what the Northerners are doing, build factories, lay railroad tracks, modernize. There's an idea of that we call the New South. But in a lot of respects, it didn't happen. The South remained overwhelmingly rural and agricultural. The industry of the South remained far less developed than that of the North throughout this period. So what you end up with is a lot of Southerners are stuck working on farms. For a lot of former slaves, they're working on the same plantations where they were slaves through these programs called sharecropping and tenant farming, which are kind of two different versions of the same thing. Again, you can read more about this. I'm not going to go too much into details, but the gist of it is the sharecropping and tenant farming systems made it really, really hard to make money, and it made it really, really easy to go into debt. So a lot of these poor farmers in the South, Black and white, this is about 80% of Black Southerners and about 50% of white Southerners, they're in this system which makes it very difficult to claw your way up, and where debt just becomes a regular aspect of life for people across the South. For Blacks in particular, this is just a time of deeply held racism and an enormous amounts of racially motivated violence. You see this book here, right? It's a commonly held belief at that time among white Southerners that Black people are sort of biologically inferior, made to work. If you look at the page on the right here, it says, the Negro a beast, but created with articulate speech and hands, that he may be of service to his master, the white man. This is a commonly held belief in 1900 when this book was published. So what we've got in the South after Reconstruction, the federal government is no longer involved in trying to help former slaves or African Americans integrate into society, vote, economically improve. The South's kind of left to its own devices, and they create this, what I'm going to call three-pillared system of racial inequality. And those pillars are, one, segregation, that in public facilities, Black and white people were kept separate. This was solidified by the Supreme Court in the Plessy versus Ferguson case, which said that as long as the facilities are equal, it's okay to keep them separate. There's this famous slogan, separate but equal. Now, in reality, the facilities were not equal. And we'll talk about that later in the course as well. But, you've probably seen images of separate water fountains and separate windows in restaurants and stuff like that. Public facilities are almost entirely kept racially separated. That's all segregation means is separation. So we've got segregation, the nickname for this being Jim Crow. We've also got disenfranchisement. This is preventing people from voting. Now, one of the dominant ways to do this, we already mentioned, that's violence. But they also had things like poll taxes, where basically you had to pay to vote. This disproportionately affected Black Southerners because they tended to have less money on hand than white Southerners. But many white Southerners were actually disenfranchised by this as well. And then the third pillar again, is violence. This is where you enter the era of lynching. Um, a lot of students tend to think of lynching as hanging, and often was hanging. But really, what lynching is kind of vigilante violence that rather than let the courts proceed and use normal legal channels to punish criminals, this is mobs of people capturing people who very often were not criminals and publicly executing them, often by hanging. These were very public spectacles of violence. There's stories of documented cases of lynchings where thousands of people attended to watch black men be not only killed but tortured and mutilated. Definitely one of the darkest chapters in American history. In the 1890s, in the period we're talking about in Unit 1, very often you've got at least one lynching per week across the United States. Again, often very public, with no legal punishment for those involved. You see a postcard created after a lynching, just to give you a sense of how publicly acceptable all this was, that you could go into a store and buy a postcard documenting the brutal, savage killing of another human being. Now, there were people advocating for changes in this period. A woman named Ida B. Wells was speaking out against lynching. Booker T. Washington was encouraging African Americans to focus on kind of job training and economic improvement. W.E.B. Du Bois was trying to more broadly culturally advance the interests of African Americans. Again, you can read more about this in American Yop as well. So before we move on to the next theme, the main thing to kind of keep in mind with the Who is an American theme is this kind of tension between people fighting to try to advance the interests of African Americans, but also people fighting to prevent those advances. And so you get these power struggles. But in many respects, the late 1800s is the absolute low point in race in America in terms of violence, especially in the post-slavery period. Violence, disenfranchisement, segregation, all of these things made a deeply unequal South, in particular, in the late 1800s. I want to shift gears now to look at our second theme, which is the economy. This one is pretty straightforward in a lot of ways. Post-Civil War America, what you want to picture is rapid industrialization. You know, back before the Civil War, here are the sections of American Yop that deal with this. Before the Civil War, you might have learned about this if you took History 1301. We did have factories, we did have some American industry, but it was pretty small, and often, as you can kind of see in this picture here, kind of integrated into nature, right? Yeah, there's a factory there, but you've also got this nice little river, you've got some trees. It's very small scale at this point. After the Civil War, it's going to look more like this, just massive installations of industrial production, you know, steel, glass, coal, all this stuff to make a much more modern, industrialized, mechanized America. So there's kind of two parts to this. There's the actual technological advance of production, and I'll talk a little bit about that. But you've also got expansion in business. Those are not necessarily the same thing. As these factories grow, businesses grow with them and they become more organized. They come up with all sorts of techniques to maximize profit and reduce costs. Again, I don't have much time to go into the details on that. You can read about some of that in American Yop as well. But companies find out how to organize themselves to maximize their profit. They find ways to combine into what we would call monopolies, what they would call trusts. They come up with legal techniques like corporations to kind of buffer the individuals involved from the fate of their corporation. This is also a great way for them to raise funds for their businesses. So, you know, if you picture the modern world with these, the modern United States with these massive companies with enormous influence over our lives, you know, today it's a lot of tech companies, and you can think about the influence of, you know, Facebook or Google or Tesla or whoever. But back then, these are primarily people who produce things, right? This is the growth of the oil industry. It's the growth of the steel industry. It's the growth of the railroad industry, et cetera, et cetera. And they're coming up with all sorts of techniques to maximize their profits. You might wonder why there's pictures of pickles here. If I were in class, I do this thing about pickles. When I talk about this concept called vertical integration, which is where, you know, a company wants to control as many parts of the production process as possible, to maximize their profits. So with a pickle company, for example, a company might want to have the actual cucumber farm, have an actual vinegar distillery, whatever, so they don't have to pay some other farm or some other distillery money to do that. So we've got vertical integration, helping companies control costs and keep as much of the production as possible under their umbrella. We've also got horizontal integration, which is basically trying to squeeze out or destroy or buy out competition. Companies are doing both of these at once, right? They're doing everything they can to swallow up or crush their competition, while they're doing everything they can to minimize their costs and maximize their profit. Companies found, all sorts of ways to pool their interests together. The most dominant one being what they call trusts. Again, you can just think of this as monopoly, right? If you're a steel company and you dominate 90% of the steel business, or if you're an oil company, you dominate 95% of the oil business or whatever, that gives you enormous power, the ability to set high rates, maximize your profit, stuff like that. So from this sort of technological and business growth, it kind of raises this broader question about, how should we think about all this? If you think about the big men of that day, like Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller, some people look at them and say, those are captains of industry, right? Those are people who are building the United States and providing all this economic growth and jobs and all that. But you've also got people who call them robber barons, who say, they're sucking up all the money at the expense of the working class. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. This cartoon is kind of a metaphor, but it is real. If you look at that thing that says, notice wages reduced 20%, that's the kind of thing that could happen to a factory worker, right? He goes to the factory to work for one of the richest men on earth and finds out, oh yeah, your pay's been cut 20%, take it or leave it. So this is a time where these men are accruing enormous, unprecedented wealth, like literally the richest human beings who ever lived were Gilded Age Americans. I mean, adjusting for inflation, they were just as wealthy as a guy like Elon Musk is today. Meanwhile, their workers are struggling to survive. So if we look at this from the workers' perspective, things are really, really tough. Wages are low, working conditions are dangerous, hours are long. It was not uncommon for a person to work 70 to 80 hours a week, doing very dangerous work, for work that could not put even food on the table for a family of four. You see here, millions of people in America at that time were injured in industrial accidents, and thousands died. Tens of thousands of people a year died working on railroads, working in steel plants. Any horrifying way of dying you can think of, people died that way. Now, for workers, as they are struggling to get by, the individual worker has no power, right? If one factory worker goes to Andrew Carnegie and says, I quit if you don't give me a raise, Andrew Carnegie will say, fine, go, I don't need you. But what workers realized is if they pooled themselves into an organization called a union, or we call this organized labor, suddenly they have power, right? Workers as a whole do the work. They're the ones who actually make all this happen. And if they use that fact to functionally negotiate with workers for better pay or better conditions or longer or shorter hours. And if they needed to, if negotiation didn't work, they had the power to strike. And you can read about that in more detail in American Yop as well. Now, one of our themes is technology and culture. On Unit 1, I don't have a lot of technology and culture stuff. I've already kind of been talking about it, but one way to think about it is just life is becoming more mechanized, right? Imagine the life of a guy working on a farm. He is living according to the cycles of nature, right? The seasons, the sun. He's working outside. He decides when his workday begins and when his workday ends. But then when he goes to work at a factory, every second of his day is dictated by the clock and the boss. There was an entire science of this called Taylorism, or scientific management, where basically every bit of inefficiency was drained out of the system, which makes a lot of sense if you're the boss, right? You don't want inefficiency if you're the boss. But maximizing efficiency very often meant just working these workers to the bone. Again, working extremely hard, 70, 80 hours a week for barely enough money to even survive. So there's this idea of life itself becoming more of a machine. Um, one metaphor for this is think about the Tin Man from The Wizard of Oz. In the book of The Wizard of Oz, which came out right in this period, he was a human being, but bit by bit, he was replaced by mechanized parts. And that's kind of how a lot of workers were feeling at this time, that they're just becoming extensions of their machines. For those of you who do the technology and culture theme for your thematic project essay, the Unit 1 excerpt is about that. The one thing we get from all this is just this massive gap between the wealthy and the poor. And of course, we have a pretty comparable gap today, and this creates all sorts of tensions, right? You've got these people at the top, accruing vast fortunes that no one could ever spend. Meanwhile, the people working for their companies can barely survive. And so the question is, well, why is this happening? And one idea that came around at the time was called social Darwinism, which kind of took the biological concept of Darwinism and applied it to people and basically said, look, if you're successful, something was good about you, you did something right. If you're rich, you deserve it. And on the other hand, if you're poor, you deserve that too. I would argue social Darwinism has a lot of really obvious counter arguments. For example, many rich people are born into wealth, right? One of the best predictors of how much money a person will make in their life is how much money did their father make. Now, that's not always true. A guy like Andrew Carnegie, he was a genuine rags to riches tale. But in general, if you're born and you start working at a factory when you're 10 years old, which many people did, I didn't really mention child labor before, but you got plenty of kids at 10 years old working 60 hours a week. They're not exactly in a position where they're going to say, get an education to help them join the middle class or start a business or something like that. So in many ways, the deck was stacked extremely unequally, which makes social Darwinism, I would argue, a fairly incomplete explanation for why things are the way they are. But it was a very commonly held belief at that time. And it's kind of raised around this, one question we can ask related to that is, who built America? Certainly part of it is the captains of industry, right? The guys who run these companies, but it's also the workers. In some ways, they're working together to build all this, but socially and economically at that time, they're often kind of working against each other, right? Unions and workers are asking for better conditions, better pay, shorter hours, while their bosses are just trying to bleed as much labor as possible out of them. Move on to continue on our who is an American theme. We talked about African Americans before, but there are certainly other groups as well who I'm going to call outsiders looking in, groups that are living in the United States, but certainly not being treated equally. Again, a number of sections of American Yacht will address these topics. So if you think about Native Americans, again, many of you took History 1301, you know the backstory on this, but really for decades at this point, centuries at this point, Native Americans have been losing their land and losing their cultures. And this was all very intentionally done by settlers and by the United States government. By the time we pick up the story after the Civil War, most Native American groups have been kind of shepherded onto reservation land. And it's really in this period that process is functionally complete. You do have tribal groups still out there attempting to live their traditional ways of life, attempting to maintain control over their ancestral lands. But largely that becomes impossible because the United States military rounds them up and forces them onto reservations. A big part of this was the destruction of the buffalo. A lot of Native American tribes relied intensely on the buffalo for food, for clothing, for tools, for all sorts of stuff. The number of buffalo in the United States went from tens of millions when Europeans first arrived to literally a few hundred by the end of the 1800s. They were killed for fun, right? People just kind of shooting them out the windows of trains, but also largely killed for their furs. People made coats out of buffalo. So men would just go kill hundreds at a time, sell the coats, sell the hides. But every one killed, its carcass is just left to rot on the plains. That's a buffalo that's not providing sustenance for a Native American tribe. Now, you do have examples of violent resistance by Native Americans. The most famous is at Little Bighorn. where the Sioux successfully defeated the U.S. military, the U.S. cavalry, U.S. Army. But again, that's the exception that proves the rule. And generally, time, the law, technology, disease, all these things are on the side of kind of white Americans against Native Americans. And so in the long run, resistance just became impossible. And what the United States government functionally required was something called assimilation. But what the United States Indian administrators wanted to see was Native American tribes kind of disowning their tribal pasts, their cultures, their languages, their ways of dressing, all of that, and adopting what we might call just white American cultural practices in terms of language, clothing, that sort of stuff. And so not only are tribes losing their lands, they're also losing their cultures, and they're losing their lives in many cases. The U.S. government very actively and intentionally transferred Native American lands into the hands of white owners. The most famous example of this is this thing called the Dawes Severalty Act, which basically incentivized Native Americans to take private possession of land. Historically, Native Americans had thought of land as kind of communal, right? This big area belongs to our tribe, rather than this is my land and this is my neighbor land and this is my neighbor's land. Whereas, modern, American law or white culture tends to look at it as private ownership. So what the Dawes Severalty Act did is it did distribute private plots to Native Americans, but then all the plots that weren't claimed went up for sale for white ownership. And so millions of acres transferred from Native American possession to white American possession. And so bit by bit, Native Americans are losing their tribes and some of their traditional cultural practices and losing their lands. There were efforts to resist this, including this massive cultural movement called the Ghost Dance, where Native Americans were adopting this kind of new cultural practice they hoped would reinvigorate their culture and kind of help them turn the tables back, regain land, regain power through this ritual. But this ritual was violently suppressed and banned by the United States government. This all led to, in 1890, this event we call the Wounded Knee Massacre, where hundreds of largely Native American women and children were gunned down by the U.S. Army. And this functionally ended the era of resistance by Native Americans and solidified the idea that in the future for Native Americans was largely on reservation land. If we look at, this is another period where immigration was a huge part of American life. If you look at the kind of history of American immigration, there's a big surge like in the 1840s and 1850s, and then a massive surge in the late 1800s and early 1900s. A lot of these immigrants are coming from new places. Historically, immigration to the United States had come from places like England, France, Germany, Scandinavia. Now it's coming from more southern and eastern Europe, so Italy, Russia, Serbia, Croatia, Greece. And these are people with unfamiliar languages, unfamiliar cultural practices, and they were very often discriminated against. Whenever you get big waves of immigration in the United States, you also tend to get big waves of what's called nativism. The idea that America's resources, America's rights, America's everything belongs to people born here, not for immigrants. This is obviously, again, a major part of our current politics, where immigration is one of the most pressing and divisive issues. This is not new. Since the beginning of the United States, immigration and anti-immigration have always gone hand in hand. We'll talk about this a little later in the course. By the 1920s, as a result of all this nativism, the United States passed severely restrictive immigration laws that really were on the books from the 20s through the 60s. And it's really only after the 60s that our current, much more diverse America, full of a diverse group of immigrants, became real. But for the end of the 1800s and much of the early 1900s, there were enormous amounts of anti-immigrant sentiment. We can also think of women, I think, as an outsider group in this period. Remember that in terms of citizenship, yeah, women were citizens, but definitely not equal ones. I mean, in the sort of social realm, much harder for a woman to gain an education, pursue a career. If you think about the legal realm, women at this time were not voting. In the late 1800s, early 1900s, women did not have the right to vote, especially in national elections anywhere in the United States. So women did fight for increased rights for themselves. I'll talk about that in a minute when I talk about progressive reform as well. But women did play an important role in society at this time. I mean, a lot of factory workers were women, for better or for worse. You do start to see by the early 1900s more women entering the professions, becoming lawyers, doctors, things like that. There was also this decades-long effort of women to gain the right to vote, which finally did bear fruit by 1920. So, women are an integral part of life at that time, of course, in a day-to-day sense, and we're fighting and achieving some victories in terms of improving their political and economic standing as well. If you think about how people thought about women's roles at that time, the ideal was kind of this middle class idea, which is still has been a prevalent idea in the 20th and 21st century for a lot of people, that a woman's role is kind of primarily domestic. That the middle class ideal at that time was that a man goes off and earns a living at a job, and a woman stays home and takes care of the house. But of course, then as now, that's a really incomplete picture of what women do and can do in society. Of course, for a lot of working class families at that time, just like for working class families today, it's not economically feasible to get by on one man's income. So millions of women did work in factories at that time, just as a large portion of women work work outside the home today. Um, so you've got this kind of ideal, and then this reality, and over time, women will again make enormous strides, especially after World War II, in terms of education and other basic equalities and rights. We're in the kind of early stages of that in the Gilded Age and early 1900s. But we do, again, like I mentioned before, have this idea. The way women are kind of being talked about at this time is changing. There's talk of this, what they would call the new woman. And again, what a new woman would be for people in that period was a woman who, let's say, got a college education, which was pretty uncommon for women at that time. A woman who enters the professions, like I mentioned before. A woman who joins protest movements or social movements. You get women working as things like social workers, trying to help people facing difficult conditions in cities at that time. And then again, the ultimate emblem of the new woman was the women gaining the right to vote by 1920. I mentioned that before. So far, we've talked about who is an American. We've talked about the economy. We talked a little bit about technology and culture. Our fourth big theme is politics and government. And my overarching claim for Unit 1 in this theme is that the role of government is really going to start to change. This is a huge theme for this entire course, something you're going to want to pay attention to throughout the course. But the basic, easy way to think about it, here are some sections of American Yawp you can look at for more on all of this, is, at least in theory, the government at that time was pretty hands-off when it comes to business in particular. And there's a fancy term for this, which is laissez-faire. It kind of just means leave it alone. So the idea was, and again, I'll explain it. I don't really think laissez-faire is an accurate way to describe things in this period. But the idea is that the government will back off and let businesses do what businesses do, let the economy do what economy does. The modern idea of government that's involved in many, many aspects of our lives, that did not exist yet in the Gilded Age. In the Gilded Age, the late 1800s, the biggest part of the government was the post office. And for a lot of people, the only way they really interacted with the United States government was when they got their mail. But I would argue laissez-faire is a pretty misleading way to think about this. The government was not hands-off. What the government was actively pro-business. So, for example, let's say workers go on strike. The government has a choice. The government could side with the workers and encourage the bosses to raise their wages or something like that. But in general, the government side with bosses and help them crush strikes. They called in the U.S. Army to suppress striking workers, stuff like that. They also passed all sorts of laws that would benefit big business. And for decades, were very reluctant to regulate big business at all. There was also very favorable tariffs and taxes at that time. We hear a lot about tariffs today. The United States government did put high tariffs at that time to foster the growth of American industry. So I would argue, rather than laissez-faire, the government for most of the Gilded Age was pretty actively pro-business, doing all sorts of things to subsidize businesses. Another really good example of this is the United States government gave land for free to railroad companies. So if you were a railroad company and you built a line of railroad track, the government would give you a square mile of land on either side of that track. So they're giving free land to railroad companies to spur their growth. That's not hands off, that's actively promoting the growth of those businesses. Over time, as things got really hard for working class people, the role of the government's going to sort of start to change. And this actually began with farmers. I haven't talked about farmers very much because when we think about the Gilded Age, we tend to picture factories and cities and all this. But really, most Americans were farmers. And as I mentioned when I talked about sharecropping and tenant farming, this is a really difficult time for farmers. Many, many farmers were building up debt. And so farmers are looking around for an explanation for why. Why are things so hard? I'm doing what I'm supposed to do, right? I get up in the morning and I farm. I cultivate my crops. And yet, every year, the amount of money I'm getting for my crops seems to be going down. The amount of money I'm paying to transport my crops via the railroad are going up. So farmers sort of developed this idea that they're doing what they're supposed to be doing, but somebody somewhere must be keeping them down. And the somebody somewhere they had in mind was basically banks, railroad companies, corporate interests. And this is kind of the essence of what we call populism. We hear this word populism used a lot today with a kind of lowercase p, populism. What populism always includes is the people, or a large group of the people, struggling and kind of blaming someone else for it, right? There must be someone somewhere who is functionally screwing me over. And that's how farmers were feeling. And they built a capital P populist movement to try to deal with it. And so for them, there's this sort of shadowy group of people. And again, there's a lot of truth to this. Corporations, railroads, who are making their lives economically challenging. So then the question becomes, well, what do we do about it? And the answer becomes the government. The government could actually be our tool for increasing our freedom. For a long time, up until this point, Americans tended to think about government as an entity that can take your freedom away. This goes all the way back to the American Revolution, where the American revolutionaries had the idea that the Parliament in England or King George III was taking their liberties away. So this is a pretty old idea that the government is largely an oppressive force. But with the Gilded Age, when we have new, big oppressive forces in the shape of corporations, big businesses, industries, suddenly the government doesn't seem so bad. And in fact, perhaps the government could be the tool to improve regular people's lives against these new limiters of liberty in industry and big business. And so the populists, the specific group of populists we're talking about here, come up with all sorts of ideas for how they can use the government to advance their interests. And again, I'm not going to go into the detail on that. You can read about it in American Yacht. But basically, they're kind of doing the same thing industrial workers did. They're pooling their resources, pooling their power, trying to gain strength in numbers. And eventually they push this into politics, and they create their own political party. They call themselves the People's Party, but you often hear them called the Populist Party. Now, you might know, third parties in American politics don't tend to succeed. Right now, as you're following the news at all, Elon Musk is trying to build the America Party, a third party. I can tell you right now, it will not succeed at any major level because the American system just doesn't really allow third parties to succeed. Generally, what they do act as spoilers, which, if anything, swing things the opposite direction from what the third party wants. So the People's Party, their idea is, well, there's more of us than there are of them. There's more farmers than anybody else. If we actually succeeded in organizing all those farmers, we could win. But remember, the two-party system in America is very entrenched. And so when the moment comes, in the election of 1896, the populists lose. But that idea they introduced, that the federal government can be our tool to help the people against an even more nefarious organization, which is, again, industry and big business, reformers are going to run with that idea really for the rest of the period we cover in this class. There you see the outcome in the 1896 election. All those red Republican states elected William McKinley, who was a kind of classic pro-business Republican. Again, in terms of the legacy of populism, what I would argue is, beyond the specifics of what they wanted, is their introduction of this idea that the federal government can be a tool to help the people, not just restrict them. And then the movement that really builds on that even more is what we call progressivism. For me, an easy way to think about progressivism is just use your imagination. I do this in my class when I have more time, and just picture what life would have been like in about 1900, and ask yourself, would you want to live that life? Generally speaking, students say no, because it was dangerous and unequal and racist and sexist. There were many, many ways in which life at that time would have been a real struggle. Well, that's all true, right? The Gilded Age did have a lot of really negative aspects for the average person. Well, progressives looked around and they see all these problems, right? They see, they see racism, they see sexism, they see inequality, they see unhealthy living conditions, they see political corruption. Everywhere you look, there's problems. And what the progressives are going to try to do is use the government to solve those problems. Again, there are many, many examples of this. I can't go into that much detail. But basically, if you think about what capitalism and industry had created at that time, in many ways it was a marvel, right? Incredible technological advances, the generation of enormous wealth. But a lot of people got spat out the bottom of that system. And so what progressivism is going to try to do is alleviate some of those side effects of capitalism. And the way they're going to do that is they're going to identify a problem, investigate the problem, publicize the problem, and ultimately pass laws to try to solve the problem. So say like a city has a contaminated water supply, progressives might try to clean up their water supply. Or maybe a neighborhood has no place for kids to play, progressives might build a park. Again, there's hundreds of examples. Those are just representative ones. Progressivism tended to kind of start at the local level and work outwards. So some states like Wisconsin really ran with this. Wisconsin spearheaded what are now kind of accepted things like workers' compensation for injured workers and stuff like that. Investing a lot in public school systems. All that stuff is going on as part of the progressive era. And then progressivism really peaks at the federal level, largely through regulation of big business. Now, again, obviously big business had built this incredible society in so many ways, right? Technologically advanced, abundant, enormous wealth being generated. But again, it also had a lot of negative outcomes for regular people. And so the federal government, especially under the presidencies of Theodore Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson, the United States becomes much more aggressive in regulating big business. This could be stuff like setting railroad rates so that railroads couldn't charge people unfair and unequal rates. It could be banning or at least allowing the government to go after trusts, monopolies that were harming consumers or harming workers. Teddy Roosevelt in particular was notorious as a trust buster, who, if he saw a monopoly that was, again, operating with corruption, operating in a way that was ripping off customers, something like that, the United States government was empowered to break up those trusts. And again, this sort of thing is still happening right up to today. We also got the creation of big federal agencies to police some of this stuff, like the Federal Trade Commission. We got all sorts of regulation of labor in terms of working conditions, hours, that sort of thing. Another aspect of life at that time was it was very, very unhealthy. This is real. In 1885, if you had a toothache, you could buy cocaine right over the counter. You could buy heroin right over the counter. This is all real. Progressives kind of realized this is really awful and gross and dangerous and addictive. So some of those products were banned from shelves. The United States government also became empowered to regulate kind of how food was produced, how food was sold. So, for example, government agents could go into a meatpacking plant and make sure that they weren't sweeping rat feces into the vats of meat and stuff like that, all of which was happening before it was regulated more by the government. You've also got the creation of environmental protection, the creation of agencies like the Federal Reserve, which is, again, still with us and still a major political talking point to this day. This is where you get the first federal income tax to pay for all this, right? If we're going to have, meat inspection agents go to these slaughterhouses, somebody's going to pay for that, right? This is all going to cost money. So the federal government, for the first time, in a permanent way, began collecting income taxes. Although it's worth noting that those income taxes were extremely low for most people, 1% for most people, but graduated upwards. I'll check in on these tax brackets once in a while in this class just to give you a sense of, for me, looking at how a government taxes its citizens tells you a lot about what that government believes. And one of the beliefs of the progressive era was that, A, we shouldn't tax people too much, but if we do, a lot of that tax should be borne by wealthier people. That wealthy people should pay a little bit more than regular people. But as you'll notice, adjusted for inflation, nobody's paying more than 1% in their taxes back then unless they made more than $600,000+ a year. That's called a good problem to have. If you think about the legacy of progressivism, it's really just, again, this change in the idea of how we think about government. That government had been seen as this oppressive force. To the progressives, there's this idea that the government can be a tool to help the people. And that's something we'll see kind of rise and fall throughout the course. We see it come to high tide in the progressive era. We see it come to high tide during the Great Depression with the New Deal. We see it come to high tide in the 1960s. But then it tends to kind of cycle up and down. And I think it would be certainly if you think about today, I think we're in kind of a low point in terms of the faith and the idea of the government as a helper of the people. But we'll get to that later in the course. Then our final theme I want to look at for Unit 1 is the United States entering the world stage. And if you think about the United States at the end of the Civil War, it is not a powerful country. It is not a kind of top-tier global power. By the end of the 1800s, it'll start to become a more globally important country. And then by the end of World War I, it really starts to step out onto the world stage. So here's a bunch of sections from American Yop that goes into more detail on this stuff. Really, after the Civil War, the United States does start to look at the world and think about how it can gain influence. And there's a couple different factors here, right? There are certainly a lot of Americans who look at the world and see people who need help. Now, again, I would argue they're looking at this through their own lens, whereby their lives and their views and their way of life is superior. But they look at people around the world and say they need modern technology. They need Christian religion. They need the modern American way of life to improve themselves. And this is not a distinctly American idea. The nations of Europe were thinking very similarly. Throughout, dating back to Columbus, European countries have been taking control over peoples around the world. And by the 1800s, much of the world was carved up by European countries, right? Much of Africa, much of the Middle East, much of Asia, much of South America at this point had gained independence. But really the entire sort of Africa, Asia landmass was kind of divvied up by European powers. And so some Americans kind of wanted to get in on that, both for the kind of, in their view, moral idea that we need to uplift the peoples of the world, whether or not they want it. This term white man's burden you see on the screen kind of captures this idea that a lot of Americans, a lot of white people at that time in the United States or in Europe had this idea that the world needs us and we're going to transform them whether they like it or not. We're going to drag them kicking and screaming into our version of the proper way to live. But of course, a lot of those people did not want to be forcibly transformed, just as we saw with Native Americans. But I'm going to call this the missionary impulse, the idea that white Americans and white Europeans are going around the world spreading their idea of the proper way to live, the proper way to worship, that sort of thing. Okay. But I'd say primarily the biggest impetus here is money, right? The world is a place that, again, white Americans or white Europeans could make some money from, and it kind of flows two ways. In one way, people in places around the world have resources the United States might want, but also those people will be markets for American-made stuff. You know, we talked about the growth of industry. All sorts of stuff is getting produced in the United States. Probably, if it's going to keep growing, it's going to be more than the American market can bear, right? Americans can only buy so many of whatever product, but if we can tap into the global market, that will really advance American economic interests. So it's kind of this, in their eyes, moral impulse, but also this commercial one. And one of the places the United States sets its sights on is Cuba, which is very close to Florida, very close to the United States, has a lot of historical linkages with the United States. Cuba at this time was still under the control of Spain, who was administering Cuba very harshly and brutally. The United States wanted to try to kind of protect Cuban interests there and protect American interests in Cuba. One way they did that is they sent a ship called the U.S. Maine to patrol the coast of Cuba, and then that ship blew up. At the time, everybody blamed Spain. We now know it was just an accident, but that doesn't really matter. This is kind of how every war we're going to talk about in this class will begin. It pretty much always begins with the idea of they attacked us. And in some cases, as we'll see, it's a false claim, as it was in this one. But once the idea of they attacked us takes hold, the fury for war grows. And so the United States went to war against Spain in Cuba. Another idea you see kicking around a lot, and for those of you who choose the U.S. and the world theme for your thematic project essay, there's a chapter about this. Americans often framed this whole topic around the idea of manliness, that this is our chance to sort of prove America's toughness. The United States goes to war against Spain and Cuba and wins, and while that's happening, also captures the islands of the Philippines, which were also controlled by Spain. So now the United States is kind of weighing this question. What do? We could create formal empire. We could give these countries independence. But for the same reason that Native Americans are being put onto reservations, for the same reason that a lot of Americans are adopting this idea of the white man's burden, it was widely believed at that time that these countries can't administer themselves. They need the United States to help them. And so the United States kind of has this debate. Imperialists say we should take these places over, we should expand America's empire. Anti-imperialists say it's better not to get involved. We don't need to control these places to trade with them. It's too much trouble, too much expense to try to administer these places on the other side of oceans, like the Philippines. So what the United States ended up doing, especially in the Philippines, is we did make the Philippines a territory of the United States. The people in the Philippines violently resisted to try to maintain their independence, and the United States pretty brutally repressed that independence struggle, killed thousands of Filipino people in order to maintain control over the Philippines. It was not until after World War II that the Philippines gained its actual independence. So this era we call the Spanish-American War, we start to see the United States entering into the global imperial struggle, but in pretty small terms compared to some of the other kind of rival nations of Europe. It's really World War I that's going to allow the United States to fully emerge on the world stage. The origins of World War I are endlessly and notoriously complicated. I'm not going to get into it. The gist of it is the United States enters this war on the side of the Allied powers after years of neutrality. The United States did not want to go to war. The average American person did not want to go to war in World War I. The United States had successfully stayed neutral throughout this period under President Woodrow Wilson. But bit by bit, the United States was getting drawn in. 1915, German submarines sank this massive ship called the Lusitania, in which over 1,000 people died, including over 100 Americans. That started to push Americans toward the Allied side. So the Allied powers are countries like England and France. The Central Powers, which became the enemy, was primarily Germany and Austria-Hungary. Germany kind of became the notorious bad guy in World War I, as we'll see and as you'll read about. But I'd say the thing that really tipped the United States towards entering World War I is this thing called the Zimmermann Telegram, where a German diplomat, basically German diplomats communicated to diplomats in Mexico that, hey, if Mexico attacks the United States, Germany will make sure they get the land back that they lost to the United States after the Mexican-American War. So that's like California, Texas, New Mexico, Arizona. Germany says you'll get all that back if you attack the United States. This was meant to be a secret communication, but it was intercepted by the United States. So now they have this idea that Germany is trying to kind of sick Mexico on the United States. And that helps convince the United States, we tried neutrality, it didn't work, we can't do it, so we're going to go to war. And so the United States enters this massive global war, ramps up industrial production to support it, drafts millions of men to fight it. Woodrow Wilson tries to see World War I as this opportunity to kind of remake the world in his image, create a more sort of peaceful, open, global scene. One of his ideas was to create something called the League of Nations, where countries could kind of talk through problems rather than resort to war, similar to the kind of modern United Nations. But one of the ironies at the end of World War I is, Wilson has this vision of the League of Nations and all these other things embodied in his 14 points. But when the war actually concludes, Wilson's vision isn't really a part of it. The United States didn't even join the League of Nations. And in many respects, the way World War I ended was according to what leaders of countries like France and Great Britain wanted. France and Great Britain had done most of the fighting, had lost most of the people. They were extremely upset with Germany, who in their eyes was the big villain in this story. So when the war ended, rather than try to create a world of openness and free trade and a League of Nations and all this, a lot of diplomats wanted to crush Germany. And so one of the ways they did that was through the Treaty of Versailles, which saddled Germany with hundreds of billions of dollars in reparations payments, which had a hugely negative effect on the German economy. They forced Germany to deindustrialize and demilitarize. All of this bred a lot of resentment. Now, you might know this, but one of Germany's soldiers in World War I was a guy named Adolf Hitler. He's a good example of someone who really resented the way that World War I ended, the way that Germany was sort of humbled and brought down by the end of World War I. And so a lot of people like Hitler for decades are sort of festering with resentment over how World War I ended. And when Hitler and men like Hitler gained power in Germany in the 30s, one of their biggest goals was undo what they saw as the damage of how World War I ended, and that's going to lead right into World War II. So in a lot of ways, the end of World War I plants these seeds for an even bigger, more horrifying war that'll come a couple decades later. So that's the end of my overview lecture for week 2. I got a little more than an hour, not too bad. Feel free to watch, hopefully you can break it up, watch it in chunks or whatever. So what you want to do as you sort of prepare for the exam in this class is use the lecture as kind of the big overview, where I organize things into themes for you, fill in some of the details with the American Yop textbook, and hopefully that'll give you a pretty good picture of what was going on in the United States from 1865 to 1918. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.